1869, Fifi Baptist Church was meeting in a 40-year-old brick meeting house located in the cemetery. Revival meetings had taken place during and after the Civil War. With the increase in attendance, the building was crowded and was showing its age. Likewise, the neighborhood had also grown and changed. The road from St. Louis to St. Charles had been realigned and no longer ran by the church grounds, but was now half of a mile to the north. In 1851, it had been paved with oak planks and had become a toll road. By 1865, the planks had been replaced with crushed rock, and the road was now called the St. Charles Rock Road. A little community had grown up around Patton's store, now Brannike's, that was located at the northwest corner of Fifi Baptist Church Road and St. Charles Rock Road. Under the leadership of Pastor Joshua Hickman, the church began discussing moving to the Rock Road Highway. In 1869, Deacon Erastus Post offered the church 5 acres of land at the southeast corner of Fifi Baptist Church Road and the St. Charles Rock Road for the price of $1. The church then made the difficult decision to relocate. The Posts transferred the deed to the land on May 24th, and on June 9th, Isaac Woods surveyed the site to establish the property lines. 3 corners of the 5-sided lot were marked with posts. As was the custom in rural areas, witness trees were selected to help locate the lot corners in case the posts were destroyed. The architectural plans were prepared by J.C. Edgar. The building was to be made of brick and to be 40 feet wide and 60 feet long. The plans included a full basement and a vestibule with a front staircase. There were to be 4 windows on each side of the main floor and the basement, and 2 windows on the front of the building. The vestibule would have a smaller window on each side. There would be buttresses on the sides of the building. Not the flying buttresses that cathedrals have, but an ordinary buttress, a simple external structure to support a wall. The building was to have 11 rows of pews with 2 aisles, and a divider ran down the middle row of pews. The floor under the pews was to be 4 inches higher than the aisles. There were to be 4 choir pews, perpendicular to the other pews, on each side of the front of the room. The basement would have 3 rooms for social services and Sunday school. The architect's specifications for the building were 18 highly detailed handwritten pages. The basement floor joists were to be red cedar, the main floor was to be of yellow pine, and the remaining lumber was to be, quote, white pine as well seasoned as can be procured. The windows were to use good Pittsburgh glass. The contract for construction was signed on September 20, 1869. The builder was to be James C. Prince. The final cost of the building would be some $10,000. With inflation, today's cost would be nearly $190,000. The next year, on April 23rd, a mortgage was taken out to finish paying the contractor.
Even before the building was dedicated, fundraising events were being held to help pay the cost. While 50 cents sounds cheap, with inflation, today's cost would be $10. The first worship service and the dedication was to take place on Sunday, July 31st, 1870. Eliza Post, Erastus Post's aunt, recorded in her journal that it was a warm day. She wrote that Erastus, his family, and all their visitors went to the dedication. The 82-year-old woman stayed home so that she could read and meditate in peace and quiet.
The speaker was the Pope, or at least a Pope, Dr. William Pope Yeaman, pastor of Third Baptist Church in St. Louis. An offering was taken which the building committee hoped would be enough to pay off the debt. It wasn't even close. In 1871, Pastor Hickman resigned after serving the church for 12 years. Through the 1870s, the church struggled as some members moved away and the remaining debt was a great burden. $5,000 was still owed in 1877. John Thomas Green became pastor in 1879, and by 1882 the debt was paid off with gifts from members, other churches, and friends of the church. Green left Fifi later that year, his work done. This is the earliest known photo of the building. Whereas the blueprint showed the stairs coming straight out from the building, the stairs instead came down to a small landing and then divided. The next 25 years were difficult times for the church. Often the pastor was shared with other churches and preaching services were only held once or twice a month. The St. Louis Mission Board covered much of the pastor's salary. In 1907, the church celebrated its centennial, and 82-year-old Joshua Hickman returned to deliver the sermon. The Baptist Orphans' Home also moved next door that year. Over the next couple of years, Sunday school attendance increased from 68 to 124. In 1908, extensive repairs were made to the building at a cost of $1,200, and electric lights were installed. Notice that the front stairs now have a landing, are no longer divided, and have white wooden handrails and spindles. In 1909, the basement was used as the temporary home for the Fifi Public School. In 1921, the St. Charles Rock Road in front of the church became the first highway in St. Louis County to be paved with concrete. In 1922, the fence around the church campus was taken down. The area was transitioning from rural to suburban. This photo, made in the early 1940s, shows a house in the background. Notice that the front stairs have changed again. They now have metal handrails and no spindles. During the 1930s, the room still had the original pew arrangement, except that choir pews on the left-hand side had been replaced by a pipe organ. During the early 1940s, the floor under the pews was dropped down to aisle height at a cost of $160, and new pews were installed. Another change during the early 1940s was installing stained glass windows. Families or friends who paid for the cost of a window could honor a family or individual by having their name inserted in the window. Let me introduce you to the people in the windows. On the east side, south to north, the first name is Thomas Music, the first pastor of the church. Thomas Roy Music was born in Virginia, served in the Army during the Revolution, farmed, taught school, and preached. He died in 1842. Next are the names of Mr. and Mrs. Erastus Post. They donated the land for the church campus. Mary Elizabeth, his first wife, was the sister of Gabriel Long, who also has a window. Erastus's second and third wives, Orissa and Ardelia, were related to George Brown, who has his own window. Erastus died in 1882, and Ardelia died in 1928. Then comes the window for Mr. and Mrs. George Wise. George was a church treasurer and leader. His wife Olive died in 1923, and George Ricketts Wise died in 1937. The final window on the east side, which today is in a storage room, is for Mr. and Mrs. George W. Brown. George was a farmer and the church clerk for 27 years. George Warren Brown died in 1922. His wife Effie served as president of the Ladies' Aid Society and was a sister to George Wise, who is in the previous window. Effie died in 1957. Since the Posts, Wises, and Browns were related, it is not surprising that they all got together at the Wise home in the World Fair year of 1904. This is Ardelia Post. Erastus was dead by this time. This is George and Olive Wise. And finally, this is George and Effie Brown. The front window on the east side is dedicated to Mr. and Mrs. Gabriel Long. Gabriel Long's wife, Virginia, was the daughter of W.D. Shoemate, who started the first school that became part of the Pattonville School District. Virginia died in 1871, and Gabriel, who had served in the Confederate Army, died in 1913. On the west side, south to north, the first name is C.O. DeHart, Jr. Bud, as he was known, was a deacon and church leader. He served the church in many ways, from baseball coach to Sunday school director. Funds for this window were raised by his Sunday school class while he was in service during World War II. Bud died in 2001. The next window is for Mr. and Mrs. O.P. Baldwin. Oscar Percival Jr. and Arabelle were second-generation Fifi members. Oscar was a painting contractor, and he and Arabelle had 4 daughters. Oscar died in 1941, and Arabelle died in 1951. Next, we have the window for the Reverend and Mrs. F.M. Baker. The Reverend Francis McCabe Baker was pastor from 1931 to 1940 and led the church through a great period of growth. His wife Claudia Ardell died in 1965, and Francis McCabe, who went by Frank, died in 1966. The final window on the west side, which is in the classroom, is for the James Dawson family. James B. Dawson was one of the original trustees of the Fifi Cemetery Association. He died in 1912. He was a farmer, was married 3 times, and was the father of 3 daughters. Mary Garrett, his first wife, died in 1879. He married his 3rd wife while in his 70s.
The front window on the west side is dedicated to Mrs. Olive Flowers Eisenhower and tells the story of a tragedy and a mystery. We know little about Olive. The 1920 census lists 13-year-old Olive Flowers as a boarder in a house whose cook was Catherine Flowers, a widow. Olive's death certificate reveals that Olive Flowers was a teenage bride married to Edmund Eisenhower. She died at age 19 in 1926 following surgery for an abdominal infection. Her parents were listed as John and Lilla Flowers. The last name on the window is spelled differently than on her death certificate. Olive's tombstone in Fifi Cemetery has another spelling for her last name. Who was it that loved her enough nearly 20 years after her death to honor her, but not know how to spell her name?
The church that had first met on the banks of Fifi Creek was growing in numbers, and during 1944, planning began for Sunday school classrooms to be added to the back of the building. The addition was to be known as the John Mason Peck Building. The addition would cost $61,400, and changes to the old building would bring the total to $72,000. The orphans' home would contribute $10,000, and the 1945 state mission offering would supply another $10,000, and Fifi would raise $10,000. Area churches made generous contributions. Third Baptist contributed $4,200, West Park gave $1,005, and Tower Grove gave $942.50. A $30,000 loan completed the financing. The addition was dedicated on September 25, 1949. The center of the back wall of the auditorium was removed so that the platform and baptistry could extend into the new building. A decorated beam and 2 columns carried the load over the opening. To the great sorrow of many, the pipe organ had to go so that doors to the Peck addition could be opened on both sides of the building's back wall. Besides providing additional Sunday school space, the Peck addition provided several firsts for Fifi. First, the Outback privy could be done away with. Fifi now had an indoor toilet. Fifi now had their own baptistry and did not have to go to St. John's or Wellston for a baptism service. Since 1807, when the Spanish governor forbade the church to have a bell on their meeting house, the church house had never had a bell. The Christina Construction Company gave the church a bell. And during the church's 200th anniversary celebration, the bell was rung. During Vacation Bible School in 1955, the room was packed. Note that the pews installed during the 1940s do not have a divider down the middle as the original pews did. The back windows and doors would be hidden by a later remodel.
And then, as growing up here as a boy, there are certain things that stick out in the mind of a boy that maybe others wouldn't remember. But before the days of air conditioning, the windows were often left open and sometimes the doors. And one thing I recall is an occasional wasp would find its way in here. And I always found that very distracting, watch the wasp fly around the room and wondering whose hair is going to get in or whatever. But fortunately, I don't remember anybody ever getting stung. And then also the part of the windows being open like that, and we were, as now, close to the airport, except when the planes would fly over them, they would drone on, the propeller sounds would just go on and loud, and sometimes you'd even have to stop. But then one of the most precious memories I have of the chapel is on Sunday mornings. Quite often, when Brother Capra was the pastor, he had a favorite call to worship he would use, Psalms 122:1. He would say, "I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord." And he was always seemed very glad to be here, and it made me glad.
In 1958, a building to house classrooms and a temporary worship auditorium was completed. The pews were moved from the auditorium to the new building, and the old auditorium sat empty. Between 1962 and 1965, the auditorium was remodeled as the Memorial Chapel at a cost of over $13,000. The renovation included structural reinforcement, electrical rewiring, new heating and air conditioning, and new oak flooring and pews. 2 rooms were partitioned off at the back of the auditorium for use as classrooms, and a balcony was added. The basement, which served as the church dining room, was also repaired and redecorated, and folding door partitions were added for Sunday school classes. After the current sanctuary was completed in 1975, the basement was no longer needed as a dining room, and in the late 1990s, the folding curtains in the basement fellowship hall were replaced with permanent partitions and a suspended ceiling was installed. During its lifetime, the building has served many purposes. For nearly 90 years, this is where the church assembled to worship. Legions of boys and girls have studied their Bible during Vacation Bible School here. Over the years, many weddings have taken place in this building. Meals on Wheels has served uncounted meals that were prepared here. Other churches in the Pattonville School District have borrowed the building. At times, the building has been filled with the joy of faith, weddings, births, and the return of those who had been called away to war. It has also experienced the sadness of those who died too young and those who failed to return. The area around the building has changed. Where wagons headed for the Oregon or the Santa Fe trails once went down the road to St. Charles, commuters now roar past and airplanes fly overhead. The surrounding area is no longer populated by farms and woods, but by subdivisions and shopping centers. The building has shown its age with its structure requiring reinforcement. Roofs have been damaged by hail, sewers have backed up, and the building barely escaped the 2011 Good Friday tornado. Even though wars, storms, pandemics, and financial crises have threatened, the church that meets here has shared the good news of the Christ both near and far. Through it all, God and His church have been faithful.